On the 7th of March 1665, a huge warship set sail from the dockyard in Chatham, on the Thames, just southeast of London. The ship was called the London, and it was a second-rate frigate, hauled along by large square sails on 3 tall masts. It was 37 metres long, 12 metres wide, and carried 64 guns on 3 decks. At the ship's rear, or stern, was the stateroom. Decorated with a Stuart lion and unicorn, the stateroom was larger even than the one on the first-rate Royal Charles. Just like its sister ship, this one had been built by the Cromwellian government for the First Anglo-Dutch War. It was now setting sail for service in the Second, and under a new, or old, government. The London had played its own role in the Restoration, being part of the convoy which had carried the restored Stuart dynasty back to their kingdoms. Where the Royal Charles had, naturally, carried King Charles, the London carried his younger brother, James, Duke of York. Then, as now, it was the ship of Vice Admiral Sir John Lawson, a veteran of the Dutch War. York was now his Lord High Admiral, and he had personally summoned Lawson for the coming campaign. Lawson himself was not on board on this cold morning. He was waiting for his flagship along with the rest of the fleet, 25 miles away, near Tilbury on the Thames. But the London was far from empty. In preparation for the coming campaign, Lawson had arranged for his old ship to be manned by men he knew and trusted, including former comrades as well as family and friends. On this short voyage, the London also carried women and children. This was not allowed according to naval regulations. Young children were one thing, they could age into service, but women were seen as a distraction for the male crew. But the journey from Chatham was only short, more of a parade than a voyage, and anyone not authorised to stay would simply disembark at Tilbury. Once the civilians had said their goodbyes to their loved ones, or settled some last-minute business, they could wave them off from the shore. The London was also packed with supplies, food and drink, including fresh water and beer, medical equipment, candles, ammunition, gunpowder, everything a warship on campaign might need. But the London would never reach Tilbury. As it approached the Thames estuary, an explosion erupted from the ship's magazine. The detonation ripped the ship apart. Only about 24 people, who happened to be in the stateroom at the time, furthest away from the magazine, were pulled from the water alive. More than 300 people were killed in the explosion or drowned in the aftermath. Vice Admiral Lawson was, naturally, devastated. He knew most of the dead. Some of them were family. He would not have long to mourn them. So began the Second Anglo-Dutch War, with the fiery destruction of the London. By the time the conflict ends, it will not be the only London lost to flames. Welcome to Pax Britannica, Season 4, Episode 4, The Royal Navy Reborn. Welcome back to Pax Britannica. I'm your host, Dr. Samuel Hume. Last time, we saw the founding of the Royal Company of Adventurers into Africa. After it struggled to make a profit, we then saw the founding of the Royal Company of Adventurers trading into Africa. They were much more successful, and they were also the first English company officially chartered to trade in enslaved people. We also saw how Restoration England was almost immediately hostile to the Netherlands, for a whole host of political, economic, and personal reasons. As well as competing for trade in West Africa, English and Dutch colonies and companies were rivals in America, the Caribbean, India, and the East Indies. Both sides were convinced that there was no reason to back down, and as tensions escalated, and colonies, ships, and outposts were attacked, 1665 began with both the United Provinces of the Netherlands and the three Stuart kingdoms going to war. This will be a naval war, so it's worth taking a look at the Restoration Royal Navy. A phrase often applied to the Restoration Royal Navy is this: gentlemen or tarpaulins. Whether naval officers were drawn from society's natural leaders in the aristocracy and gentry, the gentlemen, or from experienced seamen, the tarpaulins, named after the material that coats were made from. Obviously, the experienced officers had valuable experience, but they'd usually earned it from their time in the state's navy. Serving the Republic and the Protectorate was bad enough, but many had been appointed in the first place due to their political or religious allegiance as well as their talent. They were, to use a Restoration phrase, fanatics. With a few exceptions, they were also from humble birth. Which left the gentlemen, which included many exiled royalists and long-time supporters of the crown, men with pedigree and family lines and respectability, but, again with a few exceptions, little naval experience whatsoever. With war on the horizon, the downsized Royal Navy began to expand and recruit once again. With no army to speak of, many aristocrats volunteered for naval service. We saw this with the First Civil War. It was the traditional role of the nobility to serve their monarch in war, after all. Plus, war could be very profitable, especially if a ship was captured as a prize, and for cavaliers who had been ruined by the Revolution, this was certainly an incentive. Finding the balance between the loyalty of the gentlemen and the competence of the tarpaulins was the king's priority. That phrase, gentlemen or tarpaulins, will have a long life. Critics of the Restoration government and the disasters of the coming war will use that as a rhetorical device. MPs couldn't criticise the king or praise the Republic, and certainly not Cromwell, but they could criticise court-appointed naval commanders for incompetence, and praise the officers who first cut their teeth under the cross and harp of the Commonwealth. Rodgers sums it up, quote, "Historians have been unduly credulous in taking this political rhetoric at face value, as a comment of the real navy, rather than what it actually was, a coded language used by politicians who knew very little about the sea service, but found it a perfect vehicle for conveying their views on national issues." End quote. Because the phrase does a lot to hide the complexity of the Restoration Navy. Rodger identifies four groups: States Navy veterans, old Royalist naval commanders, Restoration gentlemen, and Restoration tarpaulins. Some people overlapped. For example, the Earl of Sandwich was from the noble Montague family, but he had served the Republic and the Protectorate, and favoured the promotion of tarpaulins. Vice-Admiral Sir John Lawson was the tarpaulin of all tarpaulins, born to a maritime family, and who had captained a coal ship at the outbreak of the Civil Wars. He had since risen to Vice-Admiral, but was held back by his birth and his illiteracy from rising further. The Restoration Navy was definitely not a meritocracy, but instead of a fixed binary, gentlemen or tarpaulins, it was a nepotism of connection rather than just birth. York, Prince Rupert, Sandwich, and the Duke of Albemarle, George Monk, were all at the top, and every officer on the way down the chain of command had one of them as patrons, as well as clients of their own. Gentlemen and tarpaulin officers brought in their family and friends. Naval dynasties would soon arise, whether they held noble titles or not, and competence and incompetence was certainly not monopolised by either gentlemen or tarpaulins. The Second Anglo-Dutch War will do a lot to paint over the divisions of the past. Many Cromwellian officers will be knighted for their service to the crown, and many gentlemen will earn good reputations for their skill at sea. But just because old divisions will disappear doesn't mean new ones won't emerge, but I'm getting ahead of myself. The English Navy at the Restoration was powerful, but that came at a cost. A specific cost, of £1.2 million of existing debt. As we've covered, the Protectorate Army was rapidly paid off and downsized into effective oblivion, but the Navy faced cost-cutting too. Many officers who were known to be Republicans or Independents were labelled fanatics and discharged from the service. Many of them returned to the merchant navy they'd come from, until the necessities of imminent war forced the Restoration government to recall these experienced sailors. War is expensive, and that debt was going nowhere. Charles needed money, which means it's time to properly introduce the Cavalier Parliament. The Cavalier Parliament met in May 1661, and it would only be dissolved in January 1679, meeting for 18 sessions over 18 years. As the name suggests, this Parliament was extremely pro-royalists in outlook and membership. Many MPs had suffered for their allegiance to the Crown during the Civil Wars and the Revolution, and there was a vengeful energy to the Commons. The vast majority of both houses were loyal to the Crown, but apart from a very brief honeymoon, that did not mean they were always loyal to the man wearing it. They would not simply rubber-stamp the King's decrees. They were still MPs. They were responsible to their constituents and for keeping the King just, and they viewed their role as an essential part of the good governance of England. That said, they did hand some power back to the Crown. In 1664, a new Triennial Act was passed by the Cavalier Parliament, which stated that a Parliament should meet at least once every 3 years, but it removed the power for Parliament to meet against the King's wishes and provided no way of enforcing this 3-year requirement. On the question of religion, Cavalier Parliament was extremely hardline. As we've seen, the Restoration settlement was fairly magnanimous on secular issues, particularly a general live and let live approach to former parliamentarians, with some exceptions. The Cavalier Parliament wasn't exactly thrilled with this, but Charles was able to get a mostly moderate settlement approved. But on religion, Parliament was deeply reactionary. Charles II's personal wish was to implement a literal broad church that was less exclusive than his father's Laudian Church of England, and more akin to the churches of Elizabeth and James. But the Cavalier Parliament, which met in the aftermath of the Fifth Monarchist Uprising, came down hard on them and all other religious dissenters. The Act of Uniformity, part of the so-called Clarendon Code, required all clergy to swear an oath to use a newly published Book of Common Prayer. If they didn't, they would be sacked from their positions. When this Book of Common Prayer came into use in 1662, 2,000 of England's 9,000 parish ministers resigned or were sacked. Following the Act of Uniformity came the Corporation Act, which banned from town and city government anyone who did not reject the Solemn League and Covenant and swear to the new Anglican sacrament. Then came the Quaker Act, which banned meetings of 5 or more Quakers, under penalty of fines and transportation. The Conventicle Act banned religious gatherings of 5 or more outside the established church. The final act of the Clarendon Code was the 5 Mile Act. Any minister or preacher who had been expelled under the Act of Uniformity could no longer come within 5 miles of their old parish or enter any town or city. Anglicans, as in those who fit within these restrictions, were given a monopoly over all secular and religious offices. The original draft of the Act of Uniformity had been even harsher to dissenters, but Clarendon, following the King's wishes as well as his personal view, had used his place in the House of Lords to mellow it out. But in 1663, a rebellion in Yorkshire was fired up by Presbyterians and other dissenters. It was nipped in the bud, but it convinced Clarendon that the government had to be strict to ensure the stability of the realm. The king was less convinced, and he proclaimed his wish to have the power to offer dispensations from the Act of Uniformity. The Commons rejected his request. It would create, quote, schism by law, end quote. Clarendon in the Lords was himself opposed, seeing such an act as, quote, ship money in religion, that nobody could know the end of." End quote. In a sign of Charles's political nous, he backed down when Parliament stood firm, but he would try again later in his reign. The Clarendon Code was the great flaw in the Restoration settlement in England, when perhaps 10% of the English population were dissenters. By zealously insisting on a single doctrine for the Church of England, instead of allowing more flexibility, as in the Elizabethan Church, it made the dissenters choose, sacrifice their beliefs to be welcomed into a church they disagreed with, or remain outside of it, come what may. By and large, they chose the latter, and the attempt to enforce uniformity only ensured it would never come back. The Cavalier Parliament is when England takes another step towards political parties, with the differing agendas of the Court Party and the Country Party. As always, when we talk about parties and factions, think of them as loose allegiances and shared agendas, more than anything formal. David Smith defines the Country Party as those MPs and peers who are most committed to defending Protestantism, to protect the rights of Parliament against the Crown, and attacking any of the King's ministers who posed a threat to those priorities. The Court Party is harder to define because it changed its ideology depending on who was at court. Clarendon will remain the King's Lord Chancellor and Chief Minister until 1667, when critics in Parliament and Court bring him down over the Anglo-Dutch War, but more on that later. Anyway, back to the Navy finances. In the years before the war, the Cavalier Parliament established a commission to establish exactly how much debt the Navy had, and in November 1664, a special tax of £2.5 million was voted, the single largest tax until the 18th century. This was certainly nothing to sniff at, but it was nowhere near enough. Even after the Navy downsized, the debt had continued to rise, and as soon as the country began preparing for war, the costs skyrocketed. Samuel Pepys was the Clerk of Acts on the Navy board, and besides writing a very detailed diary, he was something of an administrative genius. He went deep into the nitty-gritty of every aspect of supply, which will put him in a good position when Parliament starts asking where all their money went. Because, even with Pepys determined to find the Navy the best deals, that fortune of tax money dried up quickly. The Royal Navy had two powerful champions. Their names were Charles and James. The naval historian Nicholas Rodgers goes as far as to say that the reigns of the royal brothers are unique for all of English history. No other monarchs took anywhere near as much interest in the navy, and not just the big, exciting things that monarchs always like. They loved a big warship or a powerful cannon, but they were deeply interested in the technical details too. For example, Charles loved yachting, and he effectively introduced it to England as a sport. The Dutch had gifted him a yacht, but the king designed several new yachts himself, made to better handle the deep waters of the English coast. A contemporary records how the king perhaps knew too much about shipcraft than was seemly. That was not meant to be the business of kings. But both Charles and James became very skilled at navigation and how to pilot through the Thames estuary, which was not an easy thing to do. In 1664, Charles ordered that all the major rivers east of London be dredged and made better for ships. James, as we will see, will begin the Anglo-Dutch War without any naval experience, but over the course of the life, that will change. When it came to who would command the war at sea, King Charles was spoiled for choice. Possible candidates included Prince Rupert, the Duke of Albemarle, the Earl of Sandwich, or Sir William Penn. All of these were highly experienced naval commanders, and all but Rupert had served under Cromwell. In the Royal Navy, the old divisions between Cromwellian and Royalist did not pose the challenge they might have, because the man that Charles chose to be his overall commander was none of these men. He chose his brother, James, Duke of York. York was already Lord Admiral of the Navy, and he'd built up significant experience in battle, serving in various armies of the old regimes during the royal exile. But these had all been armies, as in on land. York had no experience in naval warfare, but he had the position and the status. With overall command given to York, Sir William Penn was placed aboard his flagship to advise him. The fleet itself repeated the organisation of the earlier Dutch War, which had worked so effectively. The red, white and blue squadrons, each led by an admiral, with vice and rear admirals commanding the van and rear divisions. Rupert was admiral of the white, Sandwich was admiral of the blue. Sir John Lawson was vice admiral of the red squadron, second to York himself. Sir George Ayscue was made a vice admiral and put in charge of the rear of the fleet. In case the fleet had to reverse course, it would have been Ayscue's experience at hand. Albemarle was left on land to handle the logistics of the war effort. York does seem to have been aware of the limitations of the navy and the danger that division could pose. So every morning he ordered all the flag officers to his ship to discuss and agree the order of battle and to reinforce the bonds between the men. In another echo of the Cromwellian reforms, captains were once again ordered not to break formation to chase ships for plunder. One innovation which was new was the introduction of flag signals to order the whole fleet as one to move, either tacking in a new direction or even reversing completely. Despite the placement of the inexperienced York in overall command, the Royal Navy was otherwise organised according to competence. Not so for the Dutch Navy. If you remember our episodes on the First Anglo-Dutch War, you might recall that the Dutch Navy was made up of several different admiralties for the several coastal Dutch provinces. All had their rivalries and ambitions, and so the Dutch fleet entered the war organised more due to political concerns than anything else. Their chosen leader was Jacob van Wassenaer, Heer van Obdam. He was chosen primarily because he had not come up through any of the provincial admiralties, because he hadn't come up through any admiralty. Obdam was a cavalry officer who had, with the invaluable advice of an actually experienced naval officer, defeated a Swedish naval force in 1658. His lack of allegiance to any one admiralty and his clear Republican statist sympathies meant he got the top job. Worryingly, his advisor was promoted off the ship, leaving Obdam without a source of guidance. Now, if you're wondering, what about de Ruyter? Wasn't he on hand? And no, he wasn't. He was still sailing home from his triumphant raid on the English Empire. The Royal Navy knew this, and blocking his return and recapturing whatever loot he'd picked up on his violent travels became the first English objective of the war. With that objective in mind, in spring 1665, the Royal Navy set sail. The explosion and destruction of the London was a devastating omen. A council of war of all the admirals and commanding officers met to decide on the first movements of their campaign. York favoured an immediate drive onto the Dutch coast to blockade the trade ports and cut off de Ruyter's path home. Vice Admiral Lawson, an old tarpaulin with great knowledge of the North Sea, advised against it, but York was undeterred. The fleet set sail for the Netherlands. But if York had hoped for a repeat of the States Navy blockade on Dutch ports, or the monumental achievement which was Robert Blake's long-distance blockade of Lisbon, he was going to be very disappointed. The Restoration had wound the clock back too far. This first foray of the Royal Navy was less a blockade of Lisbon and more the disastrous attack on Cadiz. The fleet didn't have anywhere near enough supplies for this expedition, and within a few days, York had to abandon the attempt. The fleet retreated to the East Anglian coast, and the Dutch followed. On the 3rd of June 1665, the two fleets met off the coast of Lowestoft. The Dutch, under Obdam on the Eendracht, had 107 ships, including 81 purpose-built warships and 11 heavily armed Indiaman merchant ships. The English, under York on the Royal Charles, had 100, with 64 warships and 24 Indiamen. York was outnumbered, but the Dutch fleet had much less firepower. The Netherlands had learned the lessons of the First Anglo-Dutch War, and they did have more large ships with more cannons in their fleet. But it's not an easy or quick thing to recalibrate your entire naval architecture, especially when every admiralty was fiercely independent. The fleets tacked towards each other. The English had the wind gauge, and had much better discipline and skill in their manoeuvres. Initially, the battle was a long-ranged artillery duel, which the English navy was much more experienced with. Over the hours of battle, the fleets drifted close enough to the continent that the gunfire could be heard in The Hague. At around 2:30 in the afternoon, as the Royal Charles duelled with the Andracht, the Dutch flagship suddenly detonated in a massive explosion. Obdam was already dead, obliterated by a direct hit from a cannonball shortly before his ship followed him. Only 5 survivors were pulled from the water. This would be a disastrous moment for any fleet. To lose a ship so dramatically was devastating to morale, especially when it's the flagship. But for the Dutch fleet, this Dutch fleet, it was chaos. Obdam had been in command because none of the more experienced admirals would serve under the others, and they all saw the explosive death of their leader and saw their freedom. After just over an hour, the entire Dutch fleet was routing under various different leaders, scattering in different directions. The English pursued until nightfall, at which point a courtier of the Duke of York gave the order to stop. He wasn't actually authorised to give this command, but he was acting on a promise to Duchess Anne to keep her beloved husband out of danger. The battle was over, but the Dutch fleet survived. The same can't be said for Vice Admiral John Lawson, who we saw return to the Navy in our cold open, and who lost so many family members and friends with the explosion of the London. It was during the pursuit of the routing enemy that a musket ball of a Dutch marksman found its mark, hitting Lawson in the knee. It didn't seem like a bad wound, and no one was overly concerned. But the injury didn't heal, and it soon developed gangrene. Lawson made it back to Greenwich, where he lingered for 4 weeks before dying on the 29th of June. He was buried 2 days later in the parish church of St. Dunstan in the east. It was almost a secret affair. Besides the minister, the only people present were 2 officers from the Admiralty who had escorted his coffin. Lawson's wife, now widow, was not there. Neither were his 2 surviving daughters. There was no one from Parliament or from the royal court. It's a surprisingly hollow funeral for a man who had, through ups and downs of politics, been in the public eye and most recently served gallantly at the side of the Duke of York. But the Church of St. Dunstan in the east is in London, and London in July 1665 was not somewhere you wanted to be if you had any choice in the matter, because death stalked the streets. The Black Death. Plague had once again returned to England. Thank you to my Patreon House of Lords, which has been joined by Earl Wade Hutt, Earl Eric Bowditch, and Earl Dylan Smith. They join my existing supporters, including the King's favourite Mike Sanders, the Duchess of Wellington Sue Bremner, the Marquis of Ludlow Nick Robinson, and the Earl of Clare Mick Wright. Thank you to all of my patrons, and remember to get your questions in for the first edition of the Britannica Gazette. Go to patreon.com/Pax Britannica for more information and to send me your questions. Thank you to Sounds Like an Earful for the interval music in today's episode, to my entire House of Lords, and to you for listening.